Welcome everyone. Our main practice, as we all know, is shikantaza, just sitting. Just sitting, adding nothing, subtracting nothing. Just being present, wholeheartedly and completely present. It sounds so easy to just do that, and yet it's very hard. But what makes it actually possible is a trust that we are basically good. This is the foundation of what makes shikantaza possible and what makes it transformative. Is we begin with some faith that we are essentially good, originally good, and that so is everybody else. We start off with some of that, which allows us to sit peacefully. And then the more we sit peacefully with attention, we begin to discover that we are actually basically good, and that everybody else is basically good. And all confusion dissolves. When we can deeply trust that we are basically good, that everybody else, no matter what they say or do, was originally born good and is good underneath the error, and that all plants and animals, whether we're scared of them or not, whether they're what we would think of as an invasive species or not, whatever they may be doing, they were born good. This is essential for shikantaza to be transformative. To just be able to sit and trust. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with me. Of course, it doesn't mean that we may not have behaviours or thoughts that are harmful, but all of those behaviours and thoughts that are harmful have been acquired, have arrived after. They arrived after our day of birth. They came later. And because they arrived and therefore are conditioned, they can be dissolved and drift away. So none of our mistaken views, our mistaken actions, things we've done wrong in the past, none of that compares to the bright, luminous reality of our essential goodness, our basic goodness. And you could say this is what makes Buddhism a religion and not a philosophy. Because some people might say, well, actually, we're just born neutral. But if we were born neutral, then we would have no issue with just letting newborn babies die. We wouldn't care. It's just neutral. Doesn't matter. Let them die. And we don't do that. We don't do that. Our impulse is to care for children. That's our impulse. People have learned how to suppress that impulse in war is a good example, tragic example, but that is that's something that's learned. It comes later. People learn to hate. People learn to not care. So if we're just quiet, we can see that things when they are born are beautiful. It's not neutral, and it's never ever bad. It's never. So this thought that sometimes comes into our cultural sort of narratives in films and so on, that there could be something such as an evil, somebody born evil. You know, this is a terrible, really most terrible thought to try and inculcate in people. There's no such thing as that. So for this practice of shikantaza, to awaken us to the full and total unconditioned truth of that basic goodness of everything, we need to have at least some faith that this is true. It's okay if we don't totally believe it's true yet, or we intellectually believe it's true, but in practice we find our heart constricts a little, or habitually constricts a little. That's okay. It's totally okay. But the more we can practice just sitting and thinking just to ourselves, there is nothing I need to add to myself or to this moment. I don't need to add anything. And I don't need to subtract anything either. I can just let thoughts go by. I don't have to hold on to them, but I don't have to try and squash them either. It's a far more radical practice than it sounds. It sounds like nothing very much, but actually most of us spend a lot of our time adding and subtracting from the present moment in a way that stems from a sense of lack or wrongness. It's not coming from a wholesome place. People perpetually often are kind of moving like that when we don't examine our lives. There's this leaning into the future, a few minutes into the future, over and over and over, all through our lives. Just short periods of peace, but lots of just leaning, make it better, change it, get rid of something, add something. And of course people have lots of thoughts of feeling inferior in some ways or superior in some ways. So this practice of shikantaza helps us to feel in our body our okayness. And this always works in parallel. When we feel greater okayness in ourselves, we're far more accepting of other people and meet them in our minds with much more compassion, much more empathy. We're much less quick to judge harshly. So it radiates out from ourselves. So this is really very powerful, central teaching, Buddha nature teachings, true nature teachings, basic goodness teaching. With no exception anywhere. There's a couple of comments about shikantaza and Buddha nature. That I could read. This is from Hakuun Yasutani Roshi. I don't know offhand his years, but he was Robert Aitken's teacher and Robert Aitken's teacher's teacher in Japan, so not too long ago, sometime in the 1900s. So I'll read a little of what he says here about shikantaza. Shikantaza should be personally and individually taught to you by a qualified teacher. While practicing shikantaza by yourself, based only on what you've read, is less harmful than unsupervised koan study, proper instructions are very rare. The Fukan Zazengi by Dogen Zenji is good instruction, but is very difficult to understand. It is especially hard to comprehend how to work with the mind and how the practice relates to enlightenment. I will briefly explain how to practice shikantaza. Generally speaking, Zazen can be described in 3 phases. First, adjusting the body. Second, the breathing. And third, the mind. The first and second are the same in both Koan Zen and shikantaza. However, the third, adjusting the mind, is done very differently in the 2 practices. To do shikantaza, one must have a firm faith in the fact that all beings are fundamentally Buddhas. So this is another way of saying it, that all beings are fundamentally Buddhas. This is the key to practicing shikantaza. But this does not at all mean that one must believe that one's small-minded, self-centered life is Buddha's life. On the contrary, casting all sorts of self-centeredness away and making yourself a clean sheet of paper, sit, just firmly sit. Sit unconditionally, knowing that sitting itself is the actualization of Buddhahood. This is the foundation of shikantaza. If one's faith in that fact is shaky, one's shikantaza is also shaky. In doing shikantaza, you must maintain mental alertness, which is of particular importance to beginners and even those who have been practicing 10 years, which could still be called beginners. Often, due to weak concentration, one becomes self-conscious or falls into a sort of trance or ecstatic state of mind. Such practice might be useful to relax yourself, but it will never lead to enlightenment and is not the practice of the Buddha way. To do shikantaza does not mean to become without thoughts, yet doing shikantaza, you do not let your mind wander. Do not even contemplate enlightenment or becoming Buddha. As soon as such thoughts arise, you have stopped doing shikantaza. Dogen said very clearly, do not attempt to become Buddha. Sit with such intensely heightened concentration, patience and alertness that if someone were to touch you while you were sitting, there'd be an electric spark. Sitting thus, you return naturally to the original Buddha, the very nature of your being. Then almost anything can plunge you into the sudden realization that all beings are originally Buddhas and all existence is perfect from the beginning. Experiencing this is called enlightenment. Personally, experiencing this is as vivid as an explosion. Regardless of how well you know the theory of explosions, only an actual explosion will do anything. In the same manner, no matter how much you know about enlightenment, until you actually experience it, you will not be intimately aware of yourself as Buddha. In short, shikantaza is the actual practice of Buddhahood itself from the very beginning. And in diligently practicing shikantaza, when the time comes, one will realize that very fact. So if we sit with some faith that we are Buddha, then suddenly in a moment we will fully realize that we are Buddha. And in the same moment we will realize that everyone is Buddha. Everyone and everything. And all we need to do to begin that is to have some faith in our own essential goodness. Just need to have some. And let it grow. We sit, we let it grow. We notice that as we start to think, maybe I am okay. Maybe the reason people aren't okay is just things that have happened to them. Maybe that's really true. We just keep contemplating like that over and over and over and over and over until we start to notice that actually we can sit really quite peacefully. And then we also start to notice that when we're having troubles, we actually can sit quite peacefully. And that's kind of a really beautiful surprise when that happens. Even when things are difficult and we're feeling very challenged, we get up in the morning and we sit for 30 minutes, let's say, and we sit peacefully. And so then we begin to sort of really feel in our body it's possible to navigate our life, to move through all the difficulty with a deep inner peace, a sense of okayness. And we make much better decisions, we make better choices, we have more skillful speech, we have more energy. And then maybe sometime, often during sesshin, suddenly becomes completely clear that this is 100% true. It's not sort of true or more or less true. We suddenly feel in every fibre of our body, it is completely true that I am basically good and that everyone and everything is basically good. Then nothing is really confusing after that. Things are still difficult, but not confusing. Only superficially confusing, like someone might say, what's 13 times 12? And momentarily we're confused. Hold on, 13 times 12, give me a minute. 144, add another 12 on that. That must be 156. Like we might have temporary confusion like that. But that's nothing, that's fine. Underneath that, no confusion. We completely understand that anyone who is behaving in a harmful way has acquired mistaken views. They've just acquired mistaken views. And whole countries that can have terrible policies that are causing terrible harm to thousands and thousands of people and devastating landscapes. It's all acquired. And because it's acquired, it can be dissolved. It may not get dissolved, but it can get dissolved. And therefore we have no hate. And we're not confused. And there is a koan that really speaks to this sense that we do not need to become a Buddha, that we're already a Buddha, and our task is simply to realize that. So I'll just read that out. It's in a number of places, but I'm just going to read it out of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. In the chapter called To Polish a Tile. Baso was a famous Zen master called the Horse Master. He was the disciple of Nangaku, one of the sixth ancestor's disciples. One day, while he was studying under Nangaku, Baso was sitting practicing Zazen. He was a man of large physical build. When he talked, his tongue reached his nose. His voice was loud, and his zazen must have been very good. Nangaku saw him sitting like a great mountain. And actually Suzuki Roshi is added here, or like a frog. Of course he liked frogs. Nangaku asked, "What are you doing?" "I am practicing Zazen," Baso replied. "Why are you practicing Zazen?" "I want to attain enlightenment. I want to be a Buddha," the disciple said. Do you know what the teacher did? He picked up a tile and he started to polish it. In Japan, after taking a tile from the kiln, we polish it to give it a beautiful finish. So Nangaku picked up a tile and started to polish it. Baso, his disciple, asked, "What are you doing?" "I want to make this tile into a jewel." Nangaku said, "How is it possible to make a tile a jewel?" Baso asked. "How is it possible to become a Buddha by practicing Zazen?" Nangaku replied. "Do you want to attain Buddhahood? There is no Buddhahood besides your ordinary mind." So of course you could make the mistake of thinking when he says, how is it possible to become a Buddha by practicing Zazen? You could make a very mistaken understanding of that Zazen is not really very good practice, or you must do something else like good works. But this is not the point that he's making. The critical point that he is making is we don't become a Buddha. We are a Buddha. We are a Buddha. We are basically good. In our shikantaza, we realize that. In our shikantaza, we start to feel the truth of that. And it's an important difference, because often people do practice with a deep sense that there's something wrong with them, and they're trying to get better. And they're trying to get better by doing things better, by sitting more firmly or learning to bow in a particular way. And of course it is good to sit in a good posture, and it is good to bow in the traditional way of our school, and to offer incense in the traditional way that we do it. That's great. And often people do good works, working out in the community. But if the reason to do that is this sense that I'm not okay, and I need to sort of prove myself to myself, and often to others, which is another thing that we often have a tendency to do, then there's a mistaken view in there, and we're off the mark, just off the mark, maybe not far off the mark, but off the mark. And this is what happens when people sometimes practice for a long time, but don't seem to quite ever get to a point of real inner ease. It's quite, it may be that they're just a little off the mark. They're trying to add and they're trying to subtract, rather than discovering the essential state. It's a very relaxing experience to just let go of everything and just sit. But it is actually quite difficult to let go of our habits. So that's the whole point of me saying what I'm saying. Is to help us just have that trust, and then we can just relax, but stay alert. Relax and alert. This is always the instruction. Thinking about whether to read something else. Maybe I'll read one more thing. This is from Keizan Jokin, who is after Dogen, to not Dogen's heir, but the next Dharma heir after that. So in the 1200s. This is from Zazen Yojinki, Notes on What to Be Aware of in Zazen. Sitting in the way to clarify the ground of experiences and to rest at ease is your actual nature. So actual nature is another phrase that gets used. Actual nature, original nature, Buddha nature. This is called the display of the original face, and revealing the landscape of the basic ground. Drop through this body-mind and you will be far beyond such forms as sitting or lying down. Beyond considerations of good or bad, transcend any divisions between usual people and sages, pass beyond the boundary between sentient beings and Buddha. Putting aside all concerns, shed all attachments. Do nothing at all. Don't fabricate any things with the six senses. Who is this? Its name is unknown. It cannot be called body. It cannot be called mind. Trying to think of it, the thought vanishes. Trying to speak of it, words die. It is like a fool, an idiot. It is as high as a mountain, deep as the ocean. Without peaks or depths, its brilliance is unthinkable. It shows itself silently. Between sky and earth, only this whole body is seen. So this is how we sit. Vast, expansive. Nothing to add, nothing to subtract. Fully attentive. It can feel sort of a little bit cool in a way, but actually it's very tender. It's very tender. You are okay. They are okay. We're all okay. We make mistakes, tragic mistakes, but underneath it all, we're basically good. So that's our practice, and that's what we cultivate for our shikantaza. So, would anyone like to comment or ask a question? Francis?
As a teacher, I've been trained to, if there's challenging behaviours in the classroom, I've been trained to be big and curious about the behaviour because it's always an indicator, or it's usually an indicator of something is not right for that child.
Yeah.
I wonder if this relates to what I was saying.
Yes, yes. I'm not sure if you could hear that. Francis was saying as a school teacher, they're encouraged, which is so nice to hear, that when a child is misbehaving, to have a big and curious response, in your mind to them, because if they're misbehaving, it's an expression of what Jack would say, an unmet need. She's been talking about that in her prison work. Whenever somebody is acting in a way that's causing harm to themselves or someone else, it's an unmet need being unskillfully expressed. It's an unmet need being unskillfully expressed, yeah. And that's the way to see it, because if we see it that way, we can see the tenderness that's underneath. Even if the child is swearing at you, or throwing a pair of scissors across the classroom, or whatever they're doing, underneath there's an unmet need, a tenderness that's wanting attention. There's a perfect little child under there wanting what it wants. And this same thing applies even when it's become very appears in very sophisticated forms, like politicians or corporate CEOs behaving in terrible ways. Still, if you look closely, you'll see it's just layers and layers underneath. There's the unmet need of a child. And we all know that, generally speaking, if a little child has an unmet need, we try to meet it. Unless we're a person that's got a lot of very disturbed, we've acquired too much trauma, our impulse is to care for the unmet needs of a child. And so we apply this equally to adults. In our minds, in our actions, you can't always go up to someone and say, look, I think you just have an unmet need. Can't go up to the Prime Minister or the President and say, like, what's really going on? What's your unmet need? Just let me... It's not going to work.
You're expressing it unskillfully.
Yes. Yes, I think you're being unskillful right now. That's not going to work.
Yeah.
But in our minds, we always can do that in our minds. Yeah. So same with a school teacher. You can't necessarily go up to a child that's being totally disruptive and say, what's your unmet need, obviously. You might have to say, okay, I'm going to take you down to the principal's office. But you can still in your mind be doing that, like, oh my God, this child, they've got a difficult home life, whatever may be happening. You just do that in your mind. And then your actions at least are skillful, even if they can't be completely what you would like to do. We can't just pick up every person and care for them. But we can in our minds do that with every person. That's why we can save all beings, that we chant that. Beings are numberless, I vow to save them. We can save them in our minds. We can't necessarily, well, obviously, we can't with our two hands and with our speech, but we can in our minds, which is good, which is a good thing. Yee.
There's an old Chinese saying, it says, everybody born with a good heart. You might have different behaviors or habits, but have very similar nature.
Yeah.
I think in nature, the first time came to my mind is the Buddha nature we talk about today.
Yes, yeah. So you just said that there's a Chinese saying, everybody is born with a good heart. That's what this teaching is. It's actually nothing really special. It's very straightforward, really. It's just that really it's very difficult for people to realise it 100%. We can realise it sort of somewhere, varies person to person, maybe between 70% and 95% or something. But we're being called on to realise it 100%. No exceptions. To this, everybody's born with a good heart. Yeah. And of course, it's not necessarily about the moment of actual birth, because of course some children, like that's not the point. Sometimes a child in utero is already harmed. Before they're even born, they're already harmed. And we should have even more compassion for a child that's born already harmed. But they weren't. There was a moment before the harm began. There's always a moment before the harm began. So it's not the point about where that is. We just can trust there's always a point before the harm began for every living being. And like what we like to say in Zen, one of the great developments in China was the addition of non-sentient beings in this whole equation. We can feel the same way towards bricks and mortar and everything. Spoons and tables. Just a general respect for their existence. So it extends to absolutely everything. All right. Well, thank you for listening. And we'll finish with our chanting.